current and former residents of an HOA. What's your I'll never live in an HOA again story? We had a house fire that cost 2 children lives. 2 days after the fire we got notices that we need to do something about the debris because it was unsightly and we were a corner lot. My old house's backyard bordered an HOA community. Our house was built 30 years before the community was built, so we weren't part of it. We used to get notices about violations and fines if we didn't correct them. Never did correct them. They finally sent legal papers to repossess our house. Went to court with a tax map that showed our property not part of the HOA community. Judge dismissed their suit against us and found them guilty of harassment. We didn't get awarded much, but I made sure to break every rule of this I could until we moved. There were 366 units spread out on over 200 plus acres of land. One of the residents got fined $1,250 for putting outdoor Christmas lights on 2 trees in front of their unit, outdoor decorations being prohibited beyond residents' front door entryway. My wife's aunt and uncle live in an HOA neighborhood. Their current problem is that the ground is higher than their first level and it's sloped towards a group of condos. Every time it rains bad, their condos flood. They don't have basements. HOA won't do anything, and it seems a few of their residents are lawyering up. This has happened since they put in a storm drain, and for some reason it backs up into their common area, which is behind the group of condos. I love reading contracts and agreements, so when a friend of mine told me about his HOA troubles and not letting him keep his boat behind his house, I jumped on the opportunity. After reading, sourcing, and finding a few rulings, I learned that they have very little power to enforce what they can't see from the road, which affects property value. He took my documentation to the HOA and requested that they remove his fines. They refused, saying the agreement says nag nag nag, and after a few months he finally paid a real estate lawyer $2,000 to go talk circles around the HOA, and they finally backed down, removed his fines, and allowed him to keep his boat. Then out of pure spite, and with my design, we built a 40 feet tall temporary structure, conforming to both the HOA agreement and building code, to fly a flag on a further 25 pole. We took it down and put it back up every 3 months for a year. You could see it from almost anywhere in the neighborhood. It was a real triumph, and it was hideous. I was putting on new siding, very obviously too, had ladders up and everything. But there was just plywood up one morning on part of my house, facing the street. I got a knock on the door at 7:30 a.m. A code enforcement officer, in uniform, looking vaguely like a cop, was visibly upset and acting like I'd taken a dump on the front sidewalk or something. Told me if I didn't have the siding up by the end of the day I'd start getting fined every day. HOA lost paperwork for change of ownership when we bought our house. They sent us letters saying there would be a lien placed on our home if we didn't pay the overdue amounts plus over $200 of late fees. I had to call them 3 times to even get someone on the phone who knew how to help me. Then I contacted escrow, who said they had already not only sent all the paperwork, but turns out we had already paid the fees. Called HOA again, and they were insistent that we hadn't paid or sent over paperwork. Called escrow again and requested they contact the HOA themselves to sort this out, and HOA still insisted we owed a late fee. Started losing my shit until escrow said they would pay the late fee. A month later we got a letter in the mail saying we were being fined for leaving our trash bins out longer than necessary. Fuck HOA. I got a letter from my HOA that my trees were not tree shaped. I got a HOA violation for my neighbor's vines growing into my yard. I'm being charged $400 because of a violation for a bush overhanging my walkway. I don't have a walkway or a bush. The picture isn't even my house. They won't back down. I lived in an HOA with my parents for 7 years down in northern Texas. We had a small tornado come through our backyard one night while I was at work, and it knocked down both the fence dividing the front yard from the backyard as well as the fence between us and our neighbors behind us. The HOA agreement included coverage for natural disasters, yet when my parents and our neighbors went to the HOA to get the fences fixed, the HOA kept denying them. 3 months later, and the threat of a lawsuit for breach of contract, and they finally fixed the fence. I will never live in an HOA, because it's too much hassle. I don't wanna have a bunch of entitled people tell me what my house can look like, or fine me for not cutting my grass to a specific measurement or whatnot. My family was fined for putting up a fence when we put a 12-inch tall wire border around our flower bed. My friend was fined in a different HOA because her garage, that was painted by the same company at the same time, and with the same paint, was a different color than her house. It wasn't. The HOA president delivered the violation notice to her on the day of her husband's funeral. Yes, he knew that she, 46-year-old, had just lost her, 48-year-old, husband 4 days before. My grandparents lived in a old folks community with a zealous HOA. My grandmother had to go to the hospital, cause of her many health problems. My grandfather would go with her. This happened once, when I was visiting. There was a knock on the door at about 10 a.m. 2 elderly women with clipboards immediately jump into a speech about how the trash cans hadn't been brought in. I explained the situation. One of them said she was in the hospital the previous week, but still managed to bring in her trash can, and handed me what looked like a ticket for $50. Fuck that shit. My daughter was a lifeguard at the pool in our community, and they weren't allowed to give out certain equipment. It was for swimming lessons. One day the HOA president asks for equipment and my daughter says no as she was instructed. The HOA president actually says, "Do you know who I am?" Then he proceeded to call her boss. When I was a kid, my parents had a house in a nice cul-de-sac, but it was a working class neighborhood. The transmission in my truck took a doo-doo, so I replaced it in our driveway. A few days later we got a letter citing a clause stating all improvements done on property must be done by a licensed contractor. It was a far reach, but they stood by it as there was nothing in the CC&Rs against working on personal vehicles. My dad made me pay him back for the fine, but for a while afterwards I'd go, put some oil or coolant under the HOA president's cars and hope he wasting money chasing a non-existent problem. HOA lost my quarterly check, sent a notice that I didn't pay an October quarter, showed them the receipt from when I dropped it off. Then started naming each quarter before, until I didn't have receipt proof they received it, and then it was that is the one you didn't pay. Tried to charge an extra $5 for something, sold the house, and moved far away. I was just learning to drive, and parked my car too far away from the curb. Parents and neighbors didn't get along, so neighbors measured the distance from the wheels to the curb and parents got fined. Now I live in the country with pretty much no rules. We have goats and emus in our front yard. Moved to Florida, where every neighborhood is an HOA. Upon moving in I felt like I had joined a sorority or fraternity, and I had to endure the hazing from the HOA. The final straw was when they sent me a letter that my white mailbox was dirty. So I decided to walk down one street and took pics of mailboxes with no doors and mailboxes that were covered in mildew, and I emailed them all to the HOA. I told them to not send me any more notices until these mailboxes were up to code. I haven't received another notice in a year. I guess I passed my initiation. This didn't happen to me, but several years ago a co-worker told me about how she and her husband put in a small in-ground pool in their backyard. They got all of the required permits and everything, and nobody said boo during the weeks of construction. After the pool was installed and they were getting ready to open it, the HOA sent them a letter informing them that it was in violation of the HOA rules and it had to be removed. I guess their community had a public pool at the clubhouse or something. They ended up going to court and spending thousands of dollars to fight it. In the end, they agreed to erect a high privacy fence around it so that it wouldn't be visible. How ridiculous. I've never lived in one, but I remember a story where a guy wanted to build something like an 8-foot privacy fence. The HOA said the fence couldn't be higher than 5 feet. The wording only said fence, so he built a 5 feet concrete partition and stuck a 5-foot fence on top of it. This sort of fits. I lived with my wife in officer housing on a military installation. Of course we had to follow certain rules so everything looked shipshape. That wasn't hard to do. What did get under my skin was the colonel driving around, taking notes, and then having her underlings issue tickets to residents for minor infractions. The one that sticks in my mind was the suckers, as they were called. I had never heard the term before. Although I kept my grass mowed per regulation, the little maple tree seeds would sprout up overnight and be an inch taller than the grass. I got a ticket for suckers in my lawn, even though the grass was freshly mowed. Okay, sure. I'll just mow the lawn every goddamn day. Sheesh. I never lived under an HOA, but that experience was enough for me to realize HOAs weren't my thing. They wanted me to switch the color of the light bulbs I used outside. Nah, I don't need someone who is that picky to have any power over my property. At that point, it's no better than renting. Edit, they were the wrong hue of white.